Hello, my name is Sarah Adefehinti and I work for Enroll Yourself. Let me share my screen. So obviously you are watching this as part of the Home Learning Summit. I hope you've enjoyed the talks so far. And yeah, I mean, it's a really weird context to be learning in, isn't it? It's we're at a weird time in the world. Um, so yeah, basically what I wanted to share today was talking a bit more about Huddlecraft. So the craft of bringing peer groups together. So this is something that we do a lot as Enroll Yourself, and I'll tell you a bit more about what we work as, what we do, and what we do with peer groups, and also how to apply it to your own context. Essentially, just because obviously, especially this year, has shown us how much we need to redefine learning and how it needs to really adapt to to the needs of the world that are constantly changing. So that's what we aim to do as Enroll Yourself, to actually use the power of peer groups to have a more adaptable and more accessible form of learning. So anyway, I'll tell you a little bit more about us before I go into that. So essentially, this is what we're all about. So huddling around steep learning curves together. So learning how to be resilient as both individuals and as a collective. And that means also as a society, by pooling together our resources, our abilities, by helping each other with peer coaching and actually helping elevate both the individual and the group as a whole. So we're all about steep learning curves. We're all about learning how to exist in the world, and also like creating learning that is suited and created by the individual as opposed to being prescriptive. So essentially, we believe that people can thrive together on this finite planet. We also know that our potential to learn how to do that is infinite, even though the planetary resources are not infinite. And we also believe that peer groups can unlock potential individuals can't unlock alone. Well, we more than believe, we have proven it throughout our work in the past 3 years. But what's really important is that craft is really required to host and participate in great peer groups. So you can't just throw a bunch of people together and expect them to work together well, or expect them to get the most out of it. You really need to have someone that holds that structure in a really, like as a craft in a really specific way in order for it to work well. I'm not going to be teaching you exactly how to do that right now, because it's it's more than a half an hour talk, definitely, and it's an experiential kind of learning as well in that sense. But I will tell you a bit about the ingredients of creating great peer groups and how peer groups can help you in your context as well. So first of all, I'm going to chat a little bit about why peer groups are great for learning. Again, obviously, we're used to having this maybe hierarchical, mostly set up to learning, especially if we're talking about schools. So you have someone teaching and other people being students, and there's a level of knowledge is imparted to you, as opposed to there being a shared knowledge, there being kind of actively working together towards a specific type of knowledge. So it's a lot about, this bearable knowledge is giving you, imparting knowledge to you. What is important to us is that actually peer groups are non-hierarchical. So if you have a peer group of people, so a group of people that you put together, but there's still a teacher in that, then that would not count for us as the peer group that we're looking for. That wouldn't be a peer group, because the peer bit doesn't exist in that. It's still a hierarchical setup, essentially. So what we find is that the ideal number of the ideal size of peer groups is about 12 people max. And that's simply because that way you can actually keep that feeling of being a peer together, and you know each other much more than you would if you were, say, 20 people, 15 people. So these kind of setups of non-hierarchical, small-based peer groups are really great for learning for these reasons. So here are our ingredients. Essentially, something that is peer-powered. So peer-powered learning relies on the assumption that everyone in the group has experience, knowledge, and presence that they can share, and that will be valuable to others. So this in itself, the act of teaching others, which I'll explain a little bit more about our context and how we do it. The act of teaching others, as you know, probably, already helps you learn deeper. So whether or not you know lots about the subject or not, while you're teaching it, you're actually learning so much more, of both in the process of research and in the process of actually, trying it out and putting yourself out there and, facilitating a group to learn something new. So that in itself is, really, really powerful for actually getting like really to the root of holding some knowledge and like embodying some knowledge, as opposed to like, how would you say it? Yeah, as opposed to reciting like information or facts that you've learned. Actually doing it with your hands and like teaching others is actually a better way, as you probably know if you're watching this already. So another great ingredient for peer learning is for it to be self-directed. So again, a self-directed learner takes the initiative in diagnosing their own learning needs, which means that they have that agency and they decide when something's not working for them, or actually they need to learn it in a different format in certain ways. They also formulate their own goals, they choose their materials and activities, they implement strategies and evaluate the results. So by that we mean that they are constantly evaluating whether or not what they're learning is good enough for them. They define what success means. So they're not being told like, oh yeah, great, you got an A in this because you did this and this and this. Like they have to choose whether or not what they're learning is actually what they want to be learning, and like, are they at the level where they want to be at? And that makes someone a much more active learner. So it makes it so that that person's not disengaged. So they're definitely not a passive learner in this sense. Again, helping promote kind of deeper learning in this sense as well. And lastly, peer learning is also design-led. So by this, we mean that it's an active exploration of real-world challenges. We often encourage people to have a project to essentially like focus their learning. So this kind of emphasizes activities that are long-term, interdisciplinary, and learner-driven. Again, with this, we have a structure, which I'll explain in a second. And when we talk about design-led, we kind of mean, following a specific structure. So we specifically talk about the double diamond, which is kind of created by the Design Council. But the way that we apply it in learning is that essentially you are focusing on a project. For us, it's a learning question. So for example, you might have a question about, how do I improve my practice as a coach? Or how can I best solve the climate crisis, contribute to solving the climate crisis with my existing skills? Could be any question like that. And that question becomes your focus. And with this kind of design thinking lens, you'd be first exploring and diverging like all of the options that you could have related to your project. And then you would, just get a bit more specific. As you've done your explorations, there will be a touch point where you'll get a bit more focused in it, and you continue that process until you've come out with something that feels like right, that is linked to your goal. So I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. But essentially, just to clarify, so these are the three kind of peer learning ingredients. So peer-powered, self-directed, design-led, all really focused on giving the learner agency and therefore having them be much more invested in their learning as opposed to, disengaged, which is, when we think about home learning, it's very, very easy to get disengaged if you're just passively watching something every single day, like day in, day out. So actually, what is a way to give back that fire for learning, that motivation for learning? So this is what some people that have taken part in our learning marathons, which is a learning journey, which I'll explain about in a second. This is what someone has said. So I entered the learning marathon aiming to become a better software developer. What I actually emerged with is far more invigorating. I have learned to nurture my irreverent nature. The reason why I've decided to put this quote is because essentially, like, it just shows you how peer learning is not just about learning, I don't know, a maths equation, or learning something that is just like purely professional or like academic, but it is really about also the development of the individual as a holistic being, which, the two can't be separated. We always learn within a social context, right? And we always learn within like our own personal context of what's going on for us in our life. To try and separate that actually hinders learning, because you can't just put things aside and pretend that nothing else is happening in your life. So actually, what we aim to do with our learning marathon is to bring the whole individual to the space, so that learning becomes holistic and it goes actually beyond what that person maybe had a goal of, and it actually becomes like their own personal development as well as professional or academic. So let me explain a little bit about the learning marathon, and this is how we bring peer learning into our space. Essentially, the learning marathon is a structure for peer group learning that can be adapted to different contexts. It's very hard to explain kind of in a few words, but this is the kind of most straightforward definition that we have. It's the sort of thing where people say you will only understand it if you've experienced it. But essentially, this is what it is. It's a structure for peer group learning. So you can do with it what you like in lots of ways. There are some like key elements to it to make it really work. As I said earlier, obviously, like bringing peer groups together requires craft. But essentially, it's a journey, it's a learning journey that leads to peer groups of people to learn together and grow together. So it's a tried and tested structure. We've had, over 10 peer groups as kind of 6-month learning journeys, but we've had more than that in different iterations. So we've worked with partners like Friends of the Earth, like Snook, like now we're going to be working with the RSA as well to create peer groups that actually work for their context as well. But essentially, it's bringing a group of people together, getting them to grow together and learn together and focus on their own learning depending on what they want to look at. So most of the groups are multidisciplinary. So actually, people are coming from all different backgrounds, all sorts of different contexts, and have different focuses for their groups. And as a group, you're all peer coaching each other and helping each other get to where you want to, which again, as I said earlier, is measured by the individual. So this is the basic structure. As I mentioned, obviously is design-led in that sense. Also, the structure is created so that you have bits of, you have like bits of accountability essentially. So every time you're exploring something, it is really important for us to also like externalize it or have a touch point so that the learner is not just kind of left to this endless sea of infinite time and possibilities, but they're actually being met with like, okay, cool, you've got 2 months to for example, be in the explore phase and to like diverge and like find all the things that are related to your question. But then on the first power up day, which you can see there in the middle, you know, it's time for you to showcase to us what you've been looking at and like where you're going to go next. That way you have the accountability. Also throughout we have, as you can see, the little blue flags are the buddy check-ins. So the idea is that in the middle of the meetups that we have as a group, you have one person that is kind of your accountability buddy. So that has been really powerful because then you're not losing momentum as much, and there's someone who's really deeply invested in what you're doing and you're invested in their learning. That is kind of keeping you there anchored. And as we mentioned earlier, I mentioned that it's, you know, self-directed and peer-powered, and that also means that each person is encouraged to actually, well, is actually, the structure is designed so that each participant is going to be teaching one of the meetups. So they're going to be facilitating on a subject that they are confident with, but also that gives them a little bit of a stretch so that the people in the group can learn about that subject. And essentially that happens every 2 weeks. There is a different person that is hosting this. So with this, it can be a bit of a stretch for the participants because, you know, especially if they don't have any facilitation skills, or if they're just learning about a subject, but it's like an emerging skill that they want to cement by teaching others. It is designed to be a bit of a push, but it's really, really valuable for someone in the group to be taking hold of a part of the structure and actually, sharing that with others. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this helps them learn deeper, but also learn beyond maybe what they expected to learn, because they're then learning how to manage a group. They're learning the kind of interpersonal qualities that are actually really needed for both like the world of work, but also to face the challenges that we need to face as a society in the next decade. So again, this is things like collaboration, learning how to do conflict resolution, or learning how to communicate, to be honest, like as a basic. So as I mentioned earlier, it's very much a holistic learning experience in that sense, being in a peer group. So this is kind of our basic structure. It can change, but the idea is that usually it is about 6 months long. And that's simply because if it was infinite, again, as I mentioned, you wouldn't have the accountability points, and you'd easily lose steam. But obviously, like, depending on your context, you know, especially if you're in schools, for example, or like a uni course that's 3 years long or anything like that, there are different ways of making it work so that you have maybe mini learning marathons within or mini peer groups, related projects that you know, work to keep the momentum up without exhausting someone. Because obviously you can't run a marathon for like 7 years. You have to have a very specific amount of time in which you're running, otherwise you just fall down exhausted and don't reach your goal. So as I said, the Learning Marathon is a collective journey that allows people to grow themselves, and it's hosted, never taught. So again, as I mentioned earlier, there isn't a hierarchy within that. There is someone who is hosting, so who is holding the structure, and is doing things like the admin, like getting the group together, as you can see here at the beginning. There is the one person that has to hold all of the structure, but other than that, it's not taught. So there isn't, the idea is that it's power with the people in your group, is not power over as a host. So the way that we share this craft of how to actually create peer groups is through the host fellowship, which we started this year. And the idea is that we essentially teach groups of facilitators how to hold peer groups. So they apply the learning marathon structure to their peer group and to their purpose. And it could be, you know, based on a theme or something else, or it could be loose and just welcome people from all backgrounds with all interests. But also within the host fellowship that we've created, we also have a peer group element to that. So the hosts that have joined our fellowship are also helping each other and teaching each other skills that they need to, or like things that have worked for them with, for example, recruitment. Yeah, essentially, like the mutual support is still there. And we try and replicate this throughout our organization, the sense of peer power, of like peer self-led values, essentially. So, all well and good me telling you what we do as an organization, but how can you apply this in your context? Obviously, as I mentioned, this is something that takes training to actually, to create a peer group that holds itself throughout, for example, 6 months. There are certain elements that work for that. However, like the idea of peer learning, of self-led learning and peer groups can still be applied to your context. And obviously only you personally will know what that really looks like. You know your people, and maybe the limitations of your context. And so playing around with that is really important. And I think in terms of, what we learned in the past 3 years is definitely that having a sense of being humble, really, and like being like, well, we're doing this, but we're also just learning together, has been really helpful, because that means that we can, first of all, keep the non-hierarchical sense that we want to be keeping. And the reason why that's important is simply because that way people feel more comfortable to actually be vulnerable, to be real, to also say that they don't know. But also in us saying, we're just testing this out, let's see how it works, like help us shape it, we actually become much better at doing what we do. Simply because when something doesn't work, we're then told that it doesn't work, and we come up with a solution together. And we really encourage our participants to be shaping and co-creating both the learning marathon structure, but also like as a peer group, but also like in a greater sense, like if something is not working as a structure in the learning marathon or in something that we're doing, then we are, continually learning as well as an organization. So in your context, it really depends on what works for you. And yeah, essentially like the way that we've used it as well with our alumni is to encourage them to teach us something that they know. So this is a screenshot from a women's empowerment workshop that one of our participants ran. So lots of people from different peer groups showed up to this, and it was really about, celebrating each other's achievements. What we found is that, it was really lovely to see lots of people turn up to it, and also that people requested like more of it as well. And also like this person who ran the group, she got a lot out of it because she wanted to be testing this out. She wanted to kind of give something back to the community. And we just found that also like brings, first of all, cross-pollinates, so actually brings people from different peer groups together, but also again continues the learning journey. Even though these people may not be in a peer group right now, they are at least like still learning together, and they still have that feeling of like, okay, cool, I choose what I want to learn. And also I know that, for example, they now know that they can get involved and teach something themselves to the rest of the group. So we're using this as a kind of continually developing our community. So I suppose it is worth thinking about, if you, for example, if you work in a school and you can't directly just be like, okay, cool, I'm going to get my students to teach a class, which obviously like is not, maybe is not even helpful in that context. Thinking about how can you actually use peer group learning to actually, as I said before, like ignite that need for learning, or ignite that passion for it, or to help students that are learning from home actually still be engaged and be active participants in their learning. So whether that is creating a group project, or whether that is getting them to, instead of writing an essay on something, getting them to research just like they are doing in an essay normally, but then getting them to do a workshop for their fellow students about it, or teach one other person about it. So yeah, finding ways of playing with that, playing with the usual structures that you have in your context would be really helpful. If you did choose to have a try with like a longer peer group context, these are some good qualities. These are some qualities that a good peer group host may have. So for example, having experience facilitating groups of people, or managing programs, projects and events. Someone who is really skilled at building relationships, or who is really willing to like work on that skill, and therefore, who has communication skills, who has emotional intelligence. Also having an open learning mindset, being flexible, resilient and adaptable to new challenges, because when you're dealing with peer groups, anything can happen, because obviously, you're dealing with 12 humans or even less than that, but you're still dealing with human beings. Everyone has something going on, and every week it might be something different. So being someone who is flexible and who is like empathetic, and who really is invested in that person's learning, whilst also understanding that life happens, that is a really, really important quality to have if you want to host a peer group. What is a nice to have is coaching skills. So being able to ask the right questions so that someone is able to come to a conclusion themselves, as opposed to being spoon-fed. So that the coaching approach is really, really key in our learning marathons and in peer group learning, really. Because again, as we said before, self-directed learning also means that you are learning much more, because you're invested in it. So with kind of a coaching approach, you are being taught to be invested in your solutions, because you're coming to them yourself, as opposed to someone prescribing it to you. Obviously, there is a time and a place for saying, no, this is how you do this. But yeah, it is also about empowering the learner. It is less about, prescribing, and more about empowering. Again, another nice to have is experience with design thinking, if this is kind of the approach that you're going through, or at least co-design and co-production. So really encouraging your participants or your students to feed into what you're learning, and to feed into the way that you're learning as well. And when working online, using, experience of using online collaboration tools like Google Docs, like Slack, things like that. So to actually make not just the experience of like, if you have a group project that is peer based, but also having the everyday feel more collaborative as well. Because if you're working on something by yourself, you're actually less likely to see all of the sides of it. But if you're working with lots of other brains, like obviously you will elevate much easier. So I'm going to leave it here. My ideal would be obviously to have a live Q&A session and to chat with people about it, because obviously everyone's needs are different. But for this format, we can't do much more than that. I've told you a little bit about how we work as Enroll Yourself, and I hope that this helps you think about, ways that you can use peer learning in your own context, even in small ways, to encourage that authenticity, that self-directedness, that agency, that empowerment for your students and for your learners. But if if you want to chat about this, if you want to have more conversations about it, if you have questions, come check us out. Come talk to us. We're on Twitter and we're on Instagram, but also you can email us as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and enjoy the rest of the Learning Summit. And hopefully, wherever you're watching this, hopefully you're having a good day. Other than that, bye-bye. Nice to meet you.